So we're continuing on with the build videos. We did the strength, dexterity, faith, and intelligence. Now we're finishing it off with the top 5 arcane builds. Now don't worry, I'm going to do some more build videos, but they'll just be a bit later on down the road. Now know before anybody asks, the Scavenger's Curve Sword's power stance is not going to be on this list because one, I just made that build recently, and with my dexterity builds, I already went over a power stance curve sword build anyway. So I'm just going to skip on that one this time around. But as always, these builds are just going to be for PvE, and if you do have any questions about how to build around these a bit earlier on in the game, then definitely just let me know down in the comments. Anyway, let's get started. The BLOODFIENDS arm is probably the best weapon to come out of the DLC, and when paired alongside a bleed infusion, it probably is the best bleed weapon as well. Now the weapon actually doesn't get any passive bleed, but it does come with an arcane scaling, so when going into a bleed infusion, it kind of doubles down into that arcane scaling to where you're just getting like monstrous amounts of bleed build up and decent returns in damage when speccing into the arcane stat, because most of the time when you're going with a bleed infusion, you don't really get that good of an arcane scaling, but with this weapon, you do. And on top of that, it just gets the best charged heavy attack in the game, as it does share the exact same animation as the Great Club, which is the fastest charged heavy attack out of all the colossal weapons and colossal swords by far. And the BLOODFIENDS arm also gets a unique AoE explosion upon the heavy attack that hits like multiple times, and this actually does scale with the bleed and just do more stance damage. So you're going to be doing roughly like 48 stance damage per hit, which is by far the most in the game in terms of a charged heavy attack, but you can also be doing like upwards of 300 bleed build up too, which is just ridiculous. So the optimal way to build around it is going to be with a charged heavy attack build and also with guard countering, because this also gets the highest poise damage when guard countering, and being that it's a colossal weapon, it's actually going to be pretty decent at blocking as well. So obviously we're going to have the axe talisman and the two-handed talisman for just more damage, more charge attack damage, the blade of mercy because we are going to be stance breaking a lot, and obviously things like Lord of Blood exaltation and the white's mask for just more damage when you do proc bleed on a nearby enemy. And we are going to have the weapon infused with Crag Blade too, which is just 15% more damage and just 10% even more stance damage on top of that, and it lasts a minute. And obviously for our crystal tier slots, we're going to go with the deflecting tier and the spiked tier, which the spiked tier is 15% more damage to our charged heavy attacks, and the deflecting tier gives us the ability to just not take much stamina damage or any damage at all when blocking at the correct time, and it just buffs our guard counters by up to 80% more damage and 50% more stance damage. So if you're going to be fighting bosses where they don't really give you an opening for a charged heavy attack, more likely than not, they're going to be very easily countered by this deflecting build. And being that we are spec'd into some arcane, we're obviously going to have the Dragon Communion Seal, and I'm just going to be using Dragon Ice as like our main projectile option, and I do have Fire Serpent as like a really quick projectile option that's pretty cheap, and obviously Gold of our Ash War slapped onto a dagger, and Flame Grant Me Strength too. The Mariah's Executioner's Sword can be an absolute high damaging machine with its weapon skill. It is a strength arcane based weapon, and with its descaling and arcane, you might not consider it to be as such. But the thing is with the arcane stats, when you go into it, it actually boosts not only the magic damage, but also the physical damage too. And it's to the point that you almost gain just as much of a return by going into arcane than you do with strength. But it still is like a decent damaging greatsword, but that skill when paired alongside things like the Shadow of Alexander, multi-hit talismans, Thorny tier, Godfrey's Icon, have this bad boy fully charged, you're going to be doing ridiculous amounts of damage as it can just hit multiple times quickly, stun lock a whole bunch of smaller enemies, and if you just have this longer opening, every single boss is just going to get destroyed. And one thing you actually may have noticed is that I do have the poison hand just sitting in my offhand, and you can literally use this weapon with every single arcane build. It doesn't have to be something like this. I'm just putting it here just to show you that you can use it, because this is a fist weapon that only weighs 1 unit, and it has a skill that can proc deadly poison in an instant, so you can just use it to proc deadly poison at the start of the fight, which is going to be like a guaranteed like 4% damage. And also, when you do proc poison on a nearby enemy with this weapon equipped, you are going to get a 7.5% damage boost for the next 20 seconds, and this can stack with things like the Mushroom Crown and the Kindred of Rot for over 40% more damage. So this thing is not really specific just for the Mariah's Executioner's Sword. You can use this with any arcane build, but it does work perfectly with this one because it is just going to help maximize our damage. And with this fist weapon, it actually can proc stance breaks really quickly because it does share the exact same heavy attack as the Star Fist. And if you're fighting enemies with smaller openings, what you can do is just proc a stance break with the poison hand and then switch to the Mariah's Executioner's Sword and use the skill. But as always with an arcane build, Dragon Communion Seal, I'm just going to have Dragon Ice as a main primary option because it's going to proc Frost really quickly, which is a nice and solid debuff. You can go into a bit more faith and use other different types of projectiles if you wanted to, but you don't really need it because our skill is just going to do most of the work for us. You can go with Flame Grant Me Strength if you wanted to, but being that a good chunk of the weapon is actually doing magic damage, you're not really benefiting as much. So maybe you can go with like damage negation stuff instead. The MOHGWYNS Sacred Spear is another amazing strength arcane weapon in this game. This one also getting some passive bleed. It is a great spear that actually gets the most range in class, amazing damage, good stance damage, but most importantly, its skill is what makes this busted, because Bloodboon Ritual does this massive fire-based AoE attack that actually can go out pretty far, encompasses the play in a 360-degree radius, and it does a bunch of damage and a bunch of blood loss build up. It can stun lock all these smaller enemies, you get a bunch of hype armor, and with consecutive inputs, You can just be destroying every single boss if you do have an opening long enough, but even if you don't, the skill actually does buff the weapon with a bit more fire damage, and you still have like a really good range and a good damaging great spear, even if you don't have the openings to use the skill, which is kind of what we are going to be building around. Obviously, we do have things like the Shard of Alexander, Fire Scorpion Charm, Fire Tear, just to just boost the damage of the skill. When you do proc bleed, we're actually going to have the buffs of the Lord of Blood Exaltation and the White Mask active, but we are also going to go with the two-handed sword talisman and the deflecting tear, and that is because the great spear guard counters are extremely good. They actually come out faster than a great sword guard counter, do just as much stance damage, and also do it in a nice poke. And with the MOHGWYNS Sacred Spear, it's obviously going to hit at a really far distance. So I just think that the deflecting build just complements the skill perfectly, because this is going to be meant for those really quick types of enemies to where you otherwise can't use the skill. Now once again, Arcane build, Dragon Communion Seal. In terms of the breath spells, I just like to go with Dragon Ice and Rotten Breath. If you do have like higher amounts of mind and you're at like a later level with more faith, then using the more expensive versions of the spells are going to be better. And then Gold Devour Ash War infused onto a dagger, Flame Grant Me Strength, and you can go with Bestial Vitality too. Now if you actually did notice you were taking too much damage, or if you didn't really care for deflecting, then I'd switch off the Fire Scorpion Charm for like a damage negation talisman, and I'd switch off the deflecting tier for the Opaline tier instead. But either way, this build is going to serve you perfectly fine. The Venomous Fang is the best poison weapon in the entire game in my opinion, as it is a claw that just gets passive deadly poison. Because yeah, deadly poison does tick for like twice as much as like regular poison, but it does only last 30 seconds, which is still perfectly fine, because that means you can actually keep the uptime of your buffs like the Kindred of Exaltation, Mushroom Crown, and Poisoned Hand. When all these things are equipped and you proc poison, you're just getting over 40% more damage for the next 20 seconds. So by the time that the poison buff wears off, you can just reapply it again and just end up getting way more damage. Head alongside the Poison Flower blooms twice, it can make for one of the most broken things in the entire game. This skill does actually scale off Arcane, so going into an Occult Infusion is obviously going to be best. And with high Arcane and an Occult Infusion, you're proccing poison in a few hits. And upon using the skill on a poison procced enemy, it makes it do bonus damage. Like it already lunges in really far, does piercing damage, has a little bit of an AoE attack, really quick recovery frames. But with a poison or rot procced enemy, it just ends up doing an additional like 6% of an enemy's health bar just on top of it. Like this is percentage damage, so like the more health an enemy has, the more damage this will be doing. Now the unfortunate part is that it does remove the status effect of poison, but with how fast you actually can proc it, and the fact that it only lasts 30 seconds anyway, is just perfectly fine. And also another good thing about the skill is that it actually does do some rot buildup, so all you gotta do is hit with it a few times and actually proc rot on an enemy as well. And you can either just choose to just let that 15% rot damage just wear off, or to just hit the enemy again with it to roughly do that 5% of an enemy's health of damage. Now the rest of the talismans for this, obviously the Shard of Alexander, the multi-hit talismans, Thorny Tear. Now we aren't gonna have the Shattered Stone talisman, and the reason for that is because most of the damage off this kicking attack is not gonna come off like the initial kick itself, it's gonna be off the AoE and that percentage damage, and those things don't get boosted by the Shattered Stone talisman. But we can actually go with the Divine Bird Warrior's Greaves if you wanted to, because it is just going to result in at least a little bit more damage, and there's no other like legs that can help boost our damage anyway. But with this build we have lots of Arcane, so obviously Dragon Communion Seal, things like Dragon Eyes as a ranged option that can proc Frost in an instant, Theodorix's Magma to use it against enemies weaker to fire damage, Hest Thread Spears for those larger bosses, Fire Serpent for a really quick projectile option that has insane tracking, and we're going to have things like Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and Blessings Boon. Now we only have 16 faith with our character, but we are going to have the faith tier equipped also, just so we can actually meet the requirements for some of these spells. But yeah, not only does this make for one of the most fun builds in the entire game, but it definitely is one of the most broken ones as well. Can't talk about the best Arcane weapons without having to touch on things like Bloodblade or a Rock Heart build with a bunch of broken ass Dragon Communion spells. So we're just going to combine both of those things together in one. The Dragon Communion spells are all broken, like the breath spells go incredibly far, just do amazing damage. Some of them can proc statuses really quickly. You also get options like Dragon Maw that can lunge in really far, do physical damage, do over 50 stance damage, and just destroy every single boss in the game. And with an Arcane build and using things like the Dragon Communion Seal, that boosts the damage of these spells by a further 20%, it's just going to ruin everything. Now the primary damaging option in this instance is going to be Dragon Maw. I think this is probably just like the best dragon spell in the game, because as you can see, the damage is just absurd, and it actually does have insane synergy alongside the Blue Dancer's Charm, because the Blue Dancer's Charm actually can boost your physical damage based on the amount of equipment load that you have. The lighter you are, the more damage you get. And with the Rock Heart's transformation, we actually still get a little bit of damage negation, but it doesn't weigh anything, so it's going to pair perfectly alongside with this. And at the weight that we do have right now, it's going to roughly equate to 12 to 13% more physical damage. And when paired alongside the Grail's Raw debuff, which can make enemies just take 10% more damage, and the Dragon Ice Frost debuff, which is going to be like an additional 20% more damage, and when things like Golden Vow, Flame Gummy Strength, the Faith tier, and after proccing Bleed as well with things like the Lord of Blood Exaltation, everything is just going to get destroyed. Now yes, as I did mention, we are going to be using Bloodblade. Now we are going to slap it just on an EXECUTIONER, and the reason being is because it is lighter than a Nagakiba, so it's going to help us a bit more in terms of the damage with the Blue Dancer's Charm, and it also has lower requirements too, in both Strength and Dexterity, which are not going to be speccing into those stats, because we're going to go with an Occult Infusion and just go all into Arcane, which is going to net us really high damage, and just maximize the damage of things like Bloodblade, which this skill is just like a better version of Reduvia in my opinion, because the skill can do more damage, especially at point blank range, do more bleed build up, consume half the amount of FP, consumes a lot less stamina too, and it can proc bleed in just like a few hits, which is going to be the major use of this EXECUTIONER. We're just going to be using it to proc bleed at the start of the fights just so we can switch to our other different types of spells and just end up destroying everything. Now other talismans that we do have on, obviously Shard of Alexander for more skill damage. We're going to have the Raw Medallion, which is just more damage to our breath types of spells. And also we're going to have 2 Dragon Communion Seals, just one in each hand. If you are going to be using your seals, make sure you have both of them equipped just so you can maximize the damage. Now yes, this is obviously just going to be meant for New Game Plus. But as for the rest of the spells, Fire Serpent for a really quick projectile option. Rotten Breath is pretty decent here as well because it also does physical damage, so it's also going to get boosted by the Blue Dancer's Charm, and it can proc rot at a decent rate too. And we are also going to have Blessings Boon to just help offset the health draining penalty that Bloodblade does give us, and we're going to throw in the Opaline tier on top as well, because this is just like a flat 15% more damage negation, and it's going to help offset the poor damage negation we're going to be getting because we're naked with the Rock Heart's Talisman. Okay, that's now done, and that is all the build videos that we're going to be making for at least a little bit now. I just want to finish off all my ranking videos first, probably make some more Soulsborne related stuff, and probably just end up diving back into the build videos, probably making some more fun stuff this time around. So definitely do subscribe for that. And I'll catch you guys around. Bye.